All right, guys. Well, welcome to tonight's class on growing rhubarb and asparagus. And I'm going to do it backwards as to how it's listed. So we're going to start out with asparagus. But yeah, like I said in the chat box, we saw where several of you were from out of state. So we welcome you on here. We've been doing these classes on Monday evenings. I think tonight is maybe the 12th night that we've been doing this. So we've got composting next Monday, and then we finish up the month of June with weed ID in the garden, if any of you are interested in that. Then we're going to take a break in July and come back in August. At the conclusion of tonight's class, for those of you that are joining us for the first time, I'll send you an email with a link to our Google Drive so you can go back and find those other classes. Some have videos in them, others will have YouTube links that you can go watch the class, as well as many resource materials in those drives as well. So help yourself to that. You'll just have to request access via the link when I send that to you. So without further ado, let's just jump right in here. And we're going to start out, like I say, with asparagus. And the reason for that is because it tends to be a little bit more finicky compared to rhubarb. But to just give you some background to the crop, so that way you'll know as far as like crop rotation and what grows well with it, which we'll talk about some of that a little bit later on. It is a member of the lily family. So some of those attributes are going to be kind of common, but just kind of keep that in mind. It is a crop that's been grown for a couple thousand years here. It was native to Europe, but it's been grown here since colonial times because they brought it with them. So it's been eaten here a lot longer than what many people first recognized. It is a hardy perennial, just as long as we get it started right. That's going to be the most tedious time is just in that first year when we plant it. It is going to need a permanent location in your garden, so don't go out there and plant it in the middle of your garden space, especially if you're utilizing tillers or irrigation or anything like that, because it is going to take a permanent space. So remember that, and it can get quite large, so you might want to even devote a specific bed just for asparagus, but it does grow well with rhubarb and strawberries and even caneberries, or I have that listed here as brambles. But if you have raspberries or blackberries that you're growing, those will all grow well together. As far as that location, they're going to prefer that north or east slope just because it's going to warm up a little bit faster in the spring, because asparagus can be more sensitive to some of those late freezes. And y'all know what I'm talking about, because this year we had a couple of those little cold spells, and if we weren't covering up those asparagus beds, we might have had a deep freeze even below that soil line, which can occur with asparagus, and especially some of you that are riding further north of us, making sure we get a mulch cover on that in the fall. As far as soil, it's going to prefer a well-drained soil. We just like with any of our crops, we don't want it bogging down in some of these heavy clay soils like we have around here. It is going to prefer a sandy loam soil. So we really need to add some organic material to help loosen that soil up before we plant. You often hear me say in classes, take a year to prepare that bed. So even though we're not teaching this normally at the time I like to, which is back in early spring, so you could get started on it this year, the other good thing about, I guess, teaching it this late in the season is that come this fall, you can devote extra time to preparing those asparagus beds and really get off to a good start for next year. If we get too much sand in our soil, then that's not going to provide enough moisture. So that's why it tends to be a little bit picky. The more sandy that soil, the more likely that those plants are going to suffer from drought stress unless we're irrigating it. Again, asparagus, it'll do okay in these heavy clay soils, but again, amending it, because you know, as our soils here in East Tennessee, as those spears start to come up, if that soil is too heavy, then that heavy soil can block those spears from forming through the ground in the early spring. So the only good thing about those heavy soils too is just water holding capacity, because again, they're not going to, asparagus is going to be really finicky on drought stress. Let's see, Oh, pH 6.0 to 7.5. You see, that's a huge range there. Usually we say 6.2 to 6.8 for garden veggies, but if you're riding a little high, that 7.0 in an asparagus bed, that's going to be okay. So that's not a typo, that is accurate. When we start getting a little bit below that 6.0, we can get into some of those secondary nutrient types, so be cautious with that. We want to do a soil test like with anything. If you're going to plant a bed devoted to asparagus, it might be a good idea to just know what your NP and K is, probably a little bit more so than even your lime recommendation. But again, if you can get that lime application on this fall and get the weeds maybe taken care of early spring, that's going to give you a little bit of a bump on getting planted next spring. You'll notice there that the fertility recommendation is for a 6-12-12, because again, like I said in other classes, if we push too much nitrogen, that first number there, we're going to get a lot of that really pretty green foliage, which Mary might like if she's growing that foliage for flowers, for bouquets to florists. But if we're growing it for that spear, we want to back off that nitrogen a little bit and push a little bit more of that P and K, because we want more fruit than we want that vegetation or that foliage. So you can kind of look here, this will correlate back to a soil test. I won't spend a lot of time going into that, but just be cognizant of the fact that we want to back off nitrogen and push the P and the K. And then before those spears emerge in the springtime, and then after you harvest, we want to provide another supplement of fertility on there. And you can just revert back to that slide to kind of see what that's going to be. Ammonium nitrate, that's a little bit harder to come by, and of course that's going to leach out a lot quicker. So if you're organic, that's also going to help build that soil tilth, and that's also a good recommendation. And there's a chart in the Google Drive that'll break all those materials down for you, so you can look at those charts and go back and forth. Just remember that soils are going to warm up quickly in the spring, and they're going to promote that early growth and harvest, but it could be a disadvantage because those asparagus spears are going to grow really, really slow in cold weather, and they can be killed back again due to a deep freeze. And I think I might have a picture in here in a few minutes, because even when those spears emerge after they've gone through a deep freeze, they're like a white bleach color and they're distorted looking, and they'll never produce more than just a few inches high. As far as the growth characteristics, it is a rhizome, so think of Bermuda grass. We all hate Bermuda grass unless we're actually growing it for a lawn, because it creeps and it crawls its way into our flower beds and our gardens. But it is a rhizome, and that's where that spear is coming from. And if you don't pick or harvest any fruit, that's what's going to result in that fern-like bush, and that can grow about 4 to 6 foot tall. You can see what those berries look like. Asparagus is a dioecious plant, so it's going to have both of those male and female flower parts. They're both going to flower. The female is what's going to produce those berries. But the bad thing is those females don't live as long as the males. And another good comparison here would be the ginkgo tree. If it's the female and they bear off that fruit that really stinks when we walk on it or drive on it. But you can see the flower parts there, just to kind of give you an idea, whoops, of what that looks like. And remember, again, it's a cool season crop, so it's going to prefer those cooler temperatures without frost, without freezes throughout the growing season. If it gets a touch of frost on it after it comes up, it'll get like a bitter taste to it. And think about okra. If we leave okra hanging too long, it gets that hard woodiness, fibrous texture. Asparagus can do that as well. But the thing to remember, it's very adaptable in Tennessee. Pretty much everywhere you can grow asparagus, just again, as long as you're getting that bed suited just right, because there are asparagus beds that can last upwards 10 to even 20 years. And also, just to remember, I think I kind of hit on it, but just to make you aware that that dormant period is what's going to preserve the carbohydrates for energy in that plant. So that's where those spears are going to come from that next year. So that's another reason after we finish harvesting, we want to put that fertility application on there. It's going to give them a little oomph for storage through the winter time. Now I've got these varieties that are going to be listed for you in the notes section of this PowerPoint, so you can refer back to that. But the 2 or 3 varieties that do really well here are going to be the Martha Washington and the Mary Washington, and then the Purple Passion. And some of those Jersey varieties are also going to grow well coming out of Rutgers University. There's several hybrids that are we're starting to see more of these hybrids on the market, and the reason for that is because those male plants live longer. So a lot of the newer varieties that we see on the market are going to have that bred in them to where we can get a little bit more sustainability on the plants. As far as planting, again, we want to do those in early spring. If you grow seeds, we got to be cognizant that they're going to be really slow to germinate, so we don't recommend that for here in Tennessee. Number one, weeds are going to be too big of an issue, and second, it's going to take us too long to bear fruit. So most of the time we recommend purchasing those 1 or 2 year crowns. I think Mary was just talking about 2-year plants, and you can do that as long as you've got that bed prepped and ready to go. But 1-year crowns is typically what we'll recommend, and you can actually harvest a little bit that first year. But then the other good advantage there is that with those 1-year crowns, you'll notice there the need for seed bed care and all those weeds. You're not going to have to put as much effort into that. And if you're like me at my house, I'm very prolific with weeds. I can grow a good stand of weeds and a good crop of rocks. So, you know, I go through there and pick them up, and it's like, seriously, how are these things multiplying like this? But okay, so we talked about strawberries back about a month or so ago, and we talked about planting by the crown, and what is a crown, why is that important? And that's especially important when we go to plant. It's where that plant stem is going to meet the roots. It's anything that's above ground, basically, the stem, the leaves, and those reproductive structures. The key here is going to be planting, so that crown is going to be at soil level. We don't want to plant deep because that's going to increase our occurrence of some of these crown rots. If we bury that crown lower than the soil level, then that ultimately is just going to lead to the death of that plant. So we got to take extra special care when we're planting just to make sure we're getting it to the right depth. And you can see that very similar to what strawberries look like, the root structure, the rhizomes are going to be a little bit bigger. And this is also in your Google Drive, so it'll be a little bit clearer. When I blew it up, it kind of blurred it out there a little bit. But you'll notice they're just planting them about 1 inch deep, cover with 3 inches of soil, and then just gradually fill that trench in during the first season. So it's almost like you're doing potatoes in a way. You're not going to heal this, but you're filling that trench up, basically. And there's also a video. It may not let me do this. What's it doing here? Yeah. I'm not going to show you the video, but it's going to be in the Google Drive, so you can go back and see how they actually plant those crowns. Just a word of caution here, if you already have an established perennial asparagus bed, or if you get one up and growing in a couple of years and you get some of these skips, don't go back and fill those skips in with newer, younger plants, because those old plants will actually inhibit the growth of those smaller, younger plants. So keep that in mind. Just let the holes go and let that asparagus fill in on its own. If those seedlings appear in an old planting, it's better to just pull those out or transplant to another area. Now, during that first growing season, we need to make sure we get adequate water. And when I say that, it's about making sure we are getting that water about 1 foot deep once a week. So if it doesn't rain in a week, and we see that often in August and September, make sure that we're getting about 1 inch of water on that ground. Don't go out there and water every single day. You hear me caution on this with many classes, but especially with asparagus, again, because of that occurrence of crown rot. That's a really big issue with asparagus. So don't water every day. If you're planting you know, a perennial bed in a raised bed, or asparagus bed in a raised bed, or if you're even doing containers, in-ground, whatever, don't water every single day. Again, just make sure you're watering once a week really, really deep, because you saw how deep those rhizome, those roots were, right? We want to make sure that's where we're putting the water in the soil. As far as mulch, getting about a 2-inch layer of organic mulch, and pretty much anything here would work. I've got shredded leaves and pine needles listed here. You could also do grass clippings, as long as you're not applying any kind of herbicide or insecticide or anything like that. In regards to leaves, you can use any kind. It doesn't matter, the hardwood. The acidity range there is not going to matter as much as it would, say, for blueberries. You can also use sawdust. That can be a little bit heavier, and that can conserve a little bit too much water, so I would be careful with that, but it will be a good component to loosening that soil up, so it'd be a really good source of organic matter. And as with anything, mulch is just going to help us retain that moisture. It's going to help us reduce that weed growth. And then the biggie is just those fluctuations in soil temp in the wintertime. Because again, that's going to help us protect a little bit against crown rot. So you've heard me mention that several times, crown rot. What is that? If we get asparagus that gets this dull brown crooked color looking, and it just kind of gets rubbery, falling over, limp biscuit there, oftentimes it's going to be a result of that crown rot. And it's going to be hard to see that if we've got a good layer of mulch. So sometimes we're going to have to investigate and dig a little deeper and find that culprit. But you can see how that pith is discolored. It should look like this little cutting right here of this root. We should have a solid white layer. But you can see how it's just basically rotten right here at that crown level. That's probably going to be caused by Fusarium or Phytophthora. And again, when we go back to some of those varieties, there is some of these newer varieties that are going to have some resistance or at least tolerance built in for these. But more or less, this is going to be a management issue up front that first year. Again, when we mulch in the spring after we do that planting, we want to come back in the fall and apply another 2 or 3 inch layer after that foliage dies. That's just going to help us with those weed populations the next year. And then asparagus will of course emerge through that next spring. So we get a lot of questions on how to irrigate, especially when we're talking deep watering, and we want to make sure that you know, we're being adequate, pushing that water deep. We don't want to be wetting the foliage. You hear me say that all the time too, because even though asparagus doesn't get a lot of foliar diseases, I think fungal pathogens or anything like that, it can still contribute to some of those occurrences of the crown rot. If we're continually wetting that plant overhead, it's just going to make that water sit right at the soil line. You've heard me say in other classes too about onions. They'll just quit growing. Any plant in the allium family will just stop growing if it has to compete with weeds. Asparagus is going to be a close second to that. You've got to get a hold of the weeds for that asparagus to take off and perform well. Shallow cultivation will often do the trick that first year, but you've just got to remember how that crown is in place, because remember we spread that crown out right at the soil line. So you don't want to be going through there right up close to the asparagus that first year and taking a hoe or especially a rototiller up close and personal to that crown. So be really cautious with that. Organic growers will sometimes use salt or vinegar and salt sometimes as a weed control. Be cautious with that if you're using salt, because that can build up in the soil and asparagus doesn't like that. So they're going to be a little bit more sensitive to some of those soluble salt build up than some other crops in the garden. And ultimately that's just going to reduce yields and lessen that lifespan of that crop. And there's just a few pictures of what that's going to look like. And of course, when it gets big and feathery, beautiful foliage. And you can see how that's in a raised bed. And you can see how shallow that raised bed is. But this is a crop that's going to throw off a good crop. You see there's virtually no weeds in that bed, which is going to be critical. One of the diseases that is going to affect asparagus has the potential, especially here in East Tennessee. When we talk about fungal pathogens, we are set up for that. because of the wind and water mechanism it takes for a fungal pathogen to reproduce. So this is the one that we're going to see the most often. So if you see this little ruddy, reddish brown stem or these lesions, you can see an early infection here on the left. It'll move into a more progressed state, and then we can have the entire stem affected. But we do have some of these newer varieties that are going to have, again, some resistance and tolerance. Just make sure that you look out for that. This is one of these occurrences that if you've never grown asparagus before, you don't know if this is going to be an issue in your garden. But if you are growing a garden this year, keep a journal of that. If you see rust appearing on some of your other crops, especially green beans, that's another one that it affects quite prolifically. Just jot that down, and you'll know that that's an organism in your garden that you might, or a pathogen in your garden you might have to deal with, and make sure you research those varieties really well. And rust is something we don't see every year too, so it's just going to depend on the weather conditions. So we're off to a good start this year, by the way, just as wet as it's been, and again the humidity, all of those things are going to contribute to fungal spread. As far as insects go, probably the only one you're really going to have to worry about is the asparagus beetle. So it's going to be just like a Japanese beetle or a June bug. Any of those beetle critters that we have in the garden, they're going to overwinter as adults in that trash around the garden and those old asparagus stalks. So that's why it's going to be really important to go through after harvest or later into the fall as we're putting the garden to bed for winter to clean that thoroughly and remove any of that debris, especially if you have any disease material or if you've seen these critters floating about. You want to move that so we're not harboring insects through the season. One of the best things you can do, you hear me say that all the time, is just burn that material, just because we're getting rid of any of those pathogens. Okay, so when do you harvest? And this is always the part I hate to talk about because everybody wants to throw stuff at me, but you can harvest it that first year as long as you're not pushing its limits. And you'll see why here in just a minute. But we would recommend not to harvest that first year. And then you'll notice here a light harvest of about 2 weeks that second year. That's going to increase the number of buds on your crowns. And then that's going to result in those subsequent higher yields every year thereafter. And you'll notice here you can harvest for about 4 weeks that third year and then 6 to 8 weeks thereafter. So if you have a little patience and just purchase asparagus at the farmer's market or the roadside stand or even the grocery store for that first year, and you get good and growing, then you'll be harvesting your own asparagus in about a year. As far as harvesting, just some tips there. You want to snap those spears off at ground level when they're about 6 to 10 inches tall. That way you're not going to do any damage to those unemerged spears. And then you're also not going to introduce any kind of pathogen if you are harvesting, say, even by knife or cutting those spears below the ground level, because we can do more damage if we do it that way. So some folks don't like to do that. They might have grown up, you know, even myself, I had to retrain myself from the way Granny used to do it. But this is actually better for the long-term sustainability if we don't go below that ground level. Harvest about every other day, and then every day during warm weather. That's just going to prevent those spears from getting too tall. And then if we have too many spindly spears, that's indicating to us that that's a weak root system. That means we might not have fed it enough the year before. We didn't get enough fertility on there. So again, you know, we harvest in the spring, but we get into late summer, early fall, again, putting the garden to bed. We might forget to put that fertility crop on there, but really make a special note to go back and do that, because that's going to give it that bump that it needs for the years thereafter. In regards to companion plants, again, you can plant amongst strawberries and horseradish. The caution there with horseradish is that it can tend to get really big and wear out its welcome. So we'll oftentimes suggest planting that in a pot, but taking the bottom out of that pot and planting that pot into the ground. And that's just going to help contain that root system a little bit better from easing into some of our other perennial beds like strawberries and asparagus and rhubarb. Oh, we can plant some basil in amongst our asparagus. We know that basil is really good for our tomato and pepper plants because it helps deter hornworms and increases flavor. It's also going to increase the vigor for our asparagus. So even going through and sowing a few seeds in that bed will be okay. Tomatoes, you'll notice here, help deter asparagus beetles. So if we come back in the springtime, you know, when we're planting our summer crops and plant those solanaceous crops, which would be tomatoes or peppers or even eggplant close to our asparagus bed, that'll do you a little bit of good there if asparagus beetles are an issue. Of course, flowers and herbs, the marigolds and the comfrey, coriander and dill are all going to go really well with asparagus. Again, be careful with the comfrey because its root system is massive, so don't plant it where it can get out of bounds with you. And if you are interplanting or planting tomatoes close with your asparagus, make sure you don't plant dill right on top of your tomatoes because that will stunt their growth. Again, the alliums can be kind of finicky, so when we think about our asparagus bed, we don't want to come back in and plant garlic, onions, or even potatoes. Now, potatoes are going to be a member of that solanaceous family, but that's the one we kind of throw out there in left field, so we don't want to be planting that close to asparagus if we don't have that dedicated asparagus bed. Garlic and onions or the alliums, they can inhibit the growth of asparagus, and even peas can be affected by that. Chives would also fall into this group, or leeks. Okay, so just as a last word of caution on asparagus, what is the most common mistake for new growers? And whoops, I didn't put that answer on here because I was going to get interactive, but we won't do that. But it's harvesting too long. So of course that first year we're not going to harvest, and we're going to get into the harvest season year 2 and year 3, and then from there on after we're just chomping at the bits to get out there and harvest our asparagus. But over harvesting can actually cause a permanent reduction in the vigor of those plants. So it's actually going to cause the health of those plants to decline, and it can actually reduce yields for each year thereafter. So, you know, if we get into that mode that we're over harvesting, we're actually going to be causing more harm than good. So the other thing too when we're harvesting is, again, to be really cautious with that spear, you know, not making too deep of a cut. We don't want to nick that plant anywhere because we're going to open, we've got an open wound there. So it's just like a cut on our skin. If we nick ourselves, then we could introduce bacteria, fungal organisms, viruses, and that can cause an infection. So same thing with our asparagus. So just be real conscientious of that. And if we get into the season and we start noticing those crooked spears, when they start emerging, because asparagus is one of those plants that's going to let you know that it's unhappy. But oftentimes those crooked spears are going to be because that heavy clay soil, it's crusted over. You could have a rocky area in your bed. It could be insects that have been feeding on it, and it could just be the cutting knife. Again, we've nicked it and accidentally introduced a pathogen, or if we're continually walking and trampling on that asparagus bed. So be cautious with that too. All right, so a rhubarb. So we're going from the lily family to the buckwheat family. And buckwheat is one of my favorite, I guess, cover crops and pollinator for summertime. So some of the same characteristics are going to apply here. Some folks will call this the pie plant. It does have a sour taste, maybe a too tart taste for some people, but actually you're going to get this. It's if I was holding this class in person, I always bake a rhubarb cobbler. So a lot of times people think about mixing strawberries and rhubarb, but if you like tartness, rhubarb is cobbler is the way to go. Again, just like asparagus, it's going to need that permanent location, and you know, asparagus grows upright more, rhubarb's going to grow out. So when you're planting your garden, because you can plant these together, just be aware of that because it's going to get really spready on you. Let's see here. I think I've talked about this. It is very acidic. And it is going to, those leaf blades are going to be poisonous to humans because of that oxalic acid, especially if you're prone to kidney stones, gallstones, any of those things caused by oxalics. Gout, that's another one. This can contribute to that, so just be cautious with that. It's going to grow really vigorously and live longer where the summers are going to be cool and moist and that soil freezes deeply during the winter. So that's what I was referring to a little bit earlier when we saw our Ohio and West Virginia friends popping on here, because they're going to have a little bit of an advantage because we don't always have that here. You'll notice here winters are going to be mild and our summers are hot, and oftentimes in August, September we turn off really dry. So our winters here in Tennessee, we don't always satisfy those cold requirements. So a good analogy would be to think about when we've talked about fruit trees and we talk about chilling hours, it would be the same type situation. Now rhubarb doesn't need chilling hours, but it is going to need that frozen soil in order to do its thing, to be a little bit more vigorous. Just be aware that we may have to do a little bit more replanting here in Tennessee because of that. It's all going to be dependent on Mother Nature and dependent on the weather. And again, we can plant these with, well, that says rhubarb, oops, asparagus, strawberries, and our caneberries. This one is going to prefer that north-facing slope, and even if we get into an area of partial shade on that southwest slope, that's going to be helpful. But we just don't want to get into a situation with heavy shade, because that's going to cause, you know, dew and fog to stick on that foliage a little bit more. In regards to soil, much like asparagus, we need a well-drained soil. It needs to be deep and nutrient rich. Again, we want to add that organic matter, so you can kind of see here we're doing much of the same thing that we're doing with asparagus. That's why they're going to grow really well together, and the strawberries. So you're going to see a lot of similarities here. We do want a soil high in organic matter. The big thing here, you never hear me say this about any other plant or crop, it's not going to really care about soil pH. It's not going to get hemmed up if we get too low. It's not going to get precarious if we get above that 7 or 7.0. It just really is going to be prolific no matter what that pH is. If we want some of that vigorous growth for years to come, we want to work the soil to about a depth of at least a foot. So if you're doing this without mechanical equipment, that might be a little bit harder to do, but you can still do that with hand rakes or trowels if you're just doing a couple of plants. Hey guys, just make sure you go in and mute your microphones if you don't care.
Indoor large gatherings.
I'm getting feedback from somebody.
Nobody's being forced
Whoops.
to come to this rally, but as we have noted, this is a record setting.
I was trying to see who that was. I was going to mute them, but I can't do all that. Okay, so anyway, working that soil to about a foot is going to be outstanding. And if we can increase the organic matter when we go into plant, add some peat moss, make our own compost, which we're going to learn about next week, or any other organic material, that's really going to help enhance that soil profile. As far as fertility, this is where it's going to maybe vary just a little different from asparagus. It is going to be a heavy feeder. So you hear us talk about that with corn crops or with our greens and our brassicas. So it's going to need pretty high nitrogen. So think about asparagus and think about rhubarb. What are we eating on each plant? You know, in asparagus, I said not to push as much nitrogen because we don't want all that foliage. But on rhubarb, we do. We want a little bit more foliage. So think about our brassicas, our cold crops like cabbage and broccoli. We're pushing a little bit higher nitrogen fertility to them. So if we're going back and adding more composted manure, any kind of compost, that's going to help push the fertility and nutrition to these plants. And you'll see there I've given you just a little bit of a recommendation. Go by your soil test if you do that. But 20 to 25 pounds of triple 13 per 1,000 square foot. And again, these tables are in the Google Drive, so you can break that down if you are on a smaller scale. Notice right here though, work that into the planting area before you set those crowns. Don't go back. That can actually burn those crowns. Varieties, this was one that kind of stumped me initially because it's one of those things you tend to share. You're neighborly, right? And you share. Somebody divides their crowns one year and you just take a plant. That's what I did with mine. I brought it from the farm in North Carolina. I couldn't tell you what kind it is. And then I got more from my other grandmother and brought it back, and it was a little bit different taste, and you could tell it was a different growing habit, but I have no clue what kinds they were. So when I was first asked about varieties, I was like, I didn't even know you could buy rhubarb at the store and plant it in your garden. I thought you just got it from a garden friend. But typically, just to let you know, if you are getting those from friends, if you've been able to divide that crown and you can see it and it looks healthy, then 9 times out of 10 it's going to transplant well and it's going to perform well for you. So it's not going to be finicky like some of our other crops if we're doing that. But I listed some varieties here and a little bit of the taste and color preferences, so you'll have that to refer to. And that's going to be in more detail in the Google Drive. You're going to plant at the same time we plant the asparagus. And you'll notice here the difference is that this is going to be a really thick, fleshy root. We're going to spread that out a little bit wider and grow it deeper than the size of the leafy portion of that plant. Think about potato buds. When you plant those, you always want a few eyes on that potato bud. Same thing with rhubarb. You want to have 2 or 3 buds on that crown. So again, if you're getting it from a friend, we don't want just this little portion right here. We want to make sure we got viable bud. And again, we've already talked about that, so I'm going to skip over the crown. But when you plant, make sure you give adequate spacing, because these are going to bush out again. So 3 to 4 foot apart in each direction, or 3 to 4 foot apart in the row, and then 4 to 5 foot in between those rows. Most home gardeners, like all of us on here, we can get by with 1 plant, and it can last us for a long, long time. So probably don't need any more than 2 unless we're growing for, farmer's market, roadside stand, or something like that. When you do plant, make sure you cover those crowns with about 1 inch of soil. And again, you've got a schematic here that just shows you we don't want to completely bury that crown below the soil line. We're even still a little too deep right there. So some of us, we might get a little heartburn when we think about that much of that plant sticking up out of the ground, but that's actually going to be more beneficial for that plant. So there's a little bit of difference in how we're planting those asparagus crowns versus rhubarb, and then even strawberry. So before you plant any of these perennial crops, go back and visit what the adequate depth is for each one of those crowns. You can grow from seed on the rhubarb. It's best to start those in a 4-inch pot, usually in February or March. You notice here that you want to grow those seedlings under cool conditions. So when we're starting seedlings indoors, we're putting all those tomato plants, for instance, under grow lights. We don't necessarily want to do that with rhubarb. We want to grow them like we do, again, those brassica crops. So think about broccoli or cabbage, because they're going to adapt in the same way. Once your seedlings get growing, you can just set those in the garden like you would crowns when they're about 4 to 6 weeks old. The key there is going to be mulching those new seedlings. That's just going to help us control weeds. We don't want to have to compete for nutrition there. It's going to help us retain that moisture and then reduce those soil temperatures as we move into those hotter summer months. Whoops, I thought I had it. Yeah, there's the picture of what the seeds look like. So I didn't put anything to scale to show you the size of that, but a little smaller than a pencil eraser, I guess. So pretty unique looking little seed. But you can see there what that looks like in 3 or 4-inch pots. And they'll do quite well if you choose to go that route. After we plant, we got to think about fertility. So we want to side dress with about 2 to 3 inches of compost. And yeah, that's a lot of compost or manure. Just make sure it's composted manure. And we're also going to add some kind of nitrogen to that. Again, remember, we're going to push more nitrogen to the rhubarb. So I put here 2 pounds of ammonium nitrate. I know that's hard to get and it's more expensive, but again, refer to that table and it's going to give you a breakdown for different nitrogen fertilizers, both organic and conventional. If you don't have compost or manure, again, grass clippings, leaves, straw. I didn't mention the straw for asparagus, but that works well too, or any other organic mulch. You want to apply fertilizer in late winter or early spring, just prior to that plant starting to resume growth. Don't attempt to work that fertilizer into the soil though, because if we do any kind of disturbing on those crowns, on those roots, then we can risk decay. They're going to be a little bit more sensitive at that root level. Notice here, lime's generally not going to be required because again, it doesn't care about pH. If we're supplying water during those dry periods late in the summer, that's going to delay and may prevent that summer dormancy. That's just going to give us a stronger and more productive crown to develop from that one dormant period from, I don't know, midsummer into the next spring. A drip or trickle tube about 18 inches from the crown, that's going to supply those plants without soaking the crowns, because just like asparagus, we're going to open up the risk of crown rot if we water overhead or we water too much. And if we run that drip system for about an hour or two whenever those leaves start wilting down, because rhubarb is one of those plants, when it gets a little stressed, when it gets thirsty, you're going to know it really quick. It's going to look like bacterial wilt on cucumbers, except at least your rhubarb will survive. But again, here's just another picture of what that crown rot's going to look like. We never want to see that dark black or even dark brown color. And this is a blurry picture, I apologize. But even these little feeder fibrous roots have got a brown tan discoloration to them, almost some slimy ick. So there's not a lot of healthy root zone in that plant. The bad thing is, if we get into an occurrence with crown rot, there's not going to be a cure for that. More often than not, we're going to see that in poorly drained soil. So our heavy clay soils, we can sometimes risk lack of drainage. You know, those roots will just sit in water. So even though we might not see water on the surface, if we don't have good drainage, which is the incorporation of good organic matter into that soil, then it can be rotting those plants without us even knowing it. But if you do see this, you want to remove those plants immediately. So even if it's one you've just planted this spring and you see it going down on you and you see that black ickiness, get that out of there. And don't plant rhubarb where you've had that before, because it's kind of like southern blight, some of those fungal pathogens in the soil. It can persist there and continue to cause a problem. All right, as far as mulch, we want to mulch with straw after that soil is frozen or any prolonged cold spell. So just again, think about this spring, what we had. Notice here that a light colored mulch is going to help us reflect sunlight and help keep that soil cool. So that's why strawberries we see mulched with straw. If we get a darker colored mulch, then it's going to raise that soil temp. I'm not sure why black plastic is there. That might have been talking about strawberries and we grow on those. But if we're using something besides straw, then that means that those plants can break dormancy too early. But you want to pull that mulch off. Again, think strawberries before they begin to grow in the spring. But leave that mulch material around the plants. That's going to help you control weed seed populations, and it's going to keep that root zone cool as we move through the season. Now, asparagus is going to be more finicky about weeds. Rhubarb, usually not going to be that big of an issue, because think about it, it's like a squash plant. It's going to spread out. It's going to shade out germination from a lot of those species. So it's actually going to help us control weeds. Just be cautious again about cultivating. We don't want to do that too close to rhubarb. Before I go any further, just to make mention, because a lot of the classes I have mentioned about the overhead watering and how big of a detriment that can be. And especially with some of these top plants, and as you noticed, if we get one of those crown galls, crown rots, and some of these, there's no cure for that. So if you're going to grow some of these perennial type crops, I would recommend maybe investing in some kind of drip or trickle irrigation system. Number one, just because we're going to prevent a lot of that water from falling, watering overhead. We're just going to lose a lot of water that way. But second off, it's going to allow us to control the amount of water. It's going to help us push that water down deep. And that's what we want to do, because especially here in Tennessee, if we're watering too shallow every couple of days, those roots are going to lie on top of the ground, right? And that's just going to cause more harm than good. So we might think that we're doing a good thing, and it's what I refer to as us loving our plants to death. And y'all, I've been guilty of it myself, especially in containers or raised beds. But we just want to caution against that. So if you can invest in some kind of trickle or drip, that would be a really good investment on these perennial crops. And if you take care of that through the season, it can last you for years. So that's my spiel on that. I'll get off my soapbox now. As far as insects, this is a pretty cool little critter. It's the rhubarb curculio. I've never seen this. I've only seen the plum curculio that we get sometimes in peach orchards. Unsightly little ancient looking fella there, but that's about the only insect that will manifest itself in a rhubarb crop. Now, generally, rhubarb's not too finicky. The only time it's going to be kind of finicky is when it's forming that seed stalk. So, they're going to be extra super vigorous, and they're going to produce those seed stalks during the early spring and on to the summer. So what they're doing is kind of like a daffodil bulb. They're going to use that energy reserve that should go into the development of the crown. So the best thing to do is go in here and remove that and cut them from the plant as soon as you see that. Don't let it get to that point. If you're growing it just for the prettiness, using it as an aesthetic edible type plant in your garden, and there's some people that do that. They'll grow a couple rhubarb plants to eat that's separate from rhubarb that they're going to grow like this in their garden. But if you're growing it to eat, make sure you cut those off, because we're going to take away from that food source. Rhubarb can remain productive for many years. After about 5 or more years, there's going to be many growing points that have developed on those leaf petiole. I think I've got a picture of this. And we're going to have to do some kind of division because we're going to get too crowded. But just dig those up and divide into pieces. And you, again, want to make sure you've got 1, 2, or 3 buds on that when you start gifting to a friend. And do that in early spring before those plants start to grow. And that's just going to reduce stress. It's going to reduce that transplant shock, and it's going to help get those crowns off to a better start. We can get away with 5+ years on rhubarb, even with the hot temperatures, if we are watering adequately, if we're keeping a mulch on there throughout the season, and then just pushing that fertility, especially later in the season after we've harvested. And just another tidbit, when rhubarb produces its next year's buds, it's going to be on the outer edges of that crown. So that's why it just that plant keeps getting bigger and it keeps spreading out. So it's just going to keep getting wider and wider on you. So that's why even that first year, when you have this ginormous amount of space in your garden devoted to one rhubarb plant, within 3 or 4 years, it's going to take up that space. So just be cautious with that. And you can see what a massive crown that's going to end up being as it gets older. And again, we don't want to harvest that first year. Y'all are getting used to me saying that, right? If you seedling rhubarb, you can lightly harvest that once the first year, and then just kind of treat it like it had been planted from the crown. So if you're starting from seed in pots, you can do that. A single mature rhubarb plant can produce about 2 to 6 pounds of leaf petioles a year. That's just tremendous. If you're cutting rhubarb from the plant with a knife while you're doing that, that wound remaining is going to be more susceptible to crown rot. So we've seen pictures, we've heard talk about that. You want to, I wish I could show you this in person, but you actually want to hold that stalk and pull and twist that plant when you harvest. There's no good way to demonstrate that on Zoom. But the other issue with rhubarb, which it might not be an issue if we're only growing one plant, but we could be introducing pathogens from one plant to another, or if you're using that same knife or scissors and other garden plants, you know, that can just introduce pests from other plants. So after you harvest, though, use a knife to trim those leaves from the stalks and then discard that, because those are going to be toxic. So if you leave those on there, it's just going to speed up the wilting of that stalk. You're going to, or stalk, so you're going to lose some of that crunch and crispness and even some of that flavor. The harvest season for us will usually last till about the end of June. So up until that point, you can harvest as many of those stalks as you wish. Just remember that after harvest, allow that plant to keep all of its leaves, and that's going to help build up its reserves for next year. But just keep those flower stalks cut off. So as long as we're doing that and just allowing it to do its thing, you'll be okay. And again, if you're OCD like me, it's kind of tough to not just go out there with a pair of scissors, or, you know, if you grew up in a tobacco field like I did, you know, you're out there with a pocket knife and you're clipping the tops out of those tobacco plants, and it's just cleaner and neater. And we've always heard that doesn't introduce pathogens when we're doing that. And so why are we doing this on rhubarb? But yeah, just giving it that firm twist and pull is the easiest way to harvest. And you can kind of see what those stalks look like. Beautiful in color. And again, just remember to remove and discard that entire toxic leaf blade before you cook or eat. Kind of like, I guess, shucking corn, do all that outside after you pick, silk it good before you go in the house. You've got it disposed of, you don't even forget. So just be really conscientious of that. And again, the sooner after harvest you remove that, the less edible those, or the less likely those petioles will wilt. Another common myth that we often hear, and I've heard this my entire life, is that the entire plant becomes toxic later in the summer. That's not true. There's no bearing to that. Several of the land grants have done some research on that, and there's never been any proof of that occurring. So if you've heard that, that's going to be one of those folklores that I speak about, like I did back in March. So just remember that. You can force rhubarb, and there's information here on how to do that. I'm not going to go into a lot of time, but I don't want to keep y'all on here all night. And companions, again, just like we talked about with asparagus. The big difference here, though, is that they are going to get along good with the brassicas. Any of these kale, broccoli, cabbage, cauliflower, they're going to do well in that same type environment. So you can plant your early season cold crops out there right in the midst, or next to your rhubarb, and it's not going to matter. If we have that curly dock weed, of course it's going to almost kind of look similar to the seed head of rhubarb, but it's going to draw pest in. So that's one of those weed, the only weed you would want to control next to your rhubarb. And then the other biggie is going to be slugs. So just invest in some beer and pour it in little containers throughout your garden where you got your rhubarb planted, and most of the time that'll do the trick. Or you can just use dye granules spread around the plant, and it'll help repel those, or a BT. And then, like I said, I put some recipes in there for the rhubarb cobbler and the baked asparagus. If you've never had asparagus this way, I would highly recommend it. It's quite fabulous. It's got balsamic and soy together with some sesame seeds. I don't think I put that in there, but I toss them with some sesame seeds. It's really tasty, y'all, so make sure you try it. So I wish I could have cooked it for you tonight, but That's all I have. So do you all have any questions for me?